No, thanks to you, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I know this is late in the day. I notice I have coffee and you don't. So if you need to, just come on up here and grab a sip. I really appreciate the invitation to crash your party here and tell you a little bit about this work. And super informal. So if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask. I'd rather you ask on the go than I continue without it being overly clear. So. Okay. There you go. So my timer is set. You got a little bit of the introduction, but this is because most people here will know me as a biologist. I sometimes have to explain a little bit about how I landed in this world. I have a kind of this is not meant to be an existential question. Like we're not going to do therapy here. But the reason I'm here talking about this is in part because of the unusual position I have at the University of Florida. So I was hired with a split appointment, and that means down the road, salary, teaching, advising, you name it, between two different units that work very closely together. One is the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, which is where I do the work on habitat fragmentation and plant-animal interactions. But I'm also a faculty member in the Center for Latin American Studies, in part because that's what houses the Tropical Conservation and Development Program, which is a multidisciplinary program geared towards addressing conservation problems in tropical ecosystems. But because I'm in an area studies center, even one that's unusual like ours in that it has a person like me in it, a lot of my activities there in the center are going to seminars and hearing from sociologists, economists, political scientists, co-teaching with people in a lot of different disciplines. And even though initially they were very generous in giving me space to get myself tenured, do my wildlife work, it was also really important for me to develop a research program that's more in what you would call true Latin American studies. So this is part of the progression towards trying to get there. I'm not by any means claiming that I'm someone who does the sociology of science or the economics of science, but what we're trying to do is ground some of these issues in the broader study of Latin America and the Latin American context, which is why some of the examples I'll provide are Latin America focused, because that's part of what it is my job to study. And the other thing that coincided with both my arriving at the University of Florida and being hired in an area studies program in Latin American studies was that within a couple of years I was asked to become an associate editor and then the editor-in-chief of the journal Biotropica, as Chris mentioned. And as part of my role of editor, I read the journal, I knew the journal, but I really wanted to learn a little more about the history of our field, at least through the lens of the journal that I was now nominally taking a leadership role in. So I wanted to ask a very simple question, which is, or I guess set of questions. Who are we and where do we work as tropical biologists? And to do this, I worked closely with a group of students who were mostly from the social scientists, although Franklin here in the middle is a lawyer, but led by Gabriela Stocks. And these are students who were they're social scientists taking our tropical ecology class as part of their requirements for the TCD program. So Gabriela, Lisa, Franklin, and Aaron. And the five of us got together and decided to try to tackle these questions. And so to do that, we did kind of the most basic thing you could possibly imagine, which is just to sit down and make lists. And so we looked at all the articles that were published in kind of the two leading disciplinary journals, Biotropica and the Journal of Tropical Ecology, all the articles that were published between 1995 and 2004, which is a little over 1,300 articles. And then we selected 5 years at random from that decade, and these 4 journals, Ecology, Conservation Biology, Biological Conservation, and Ecology, and from those 5 random years selected all the articles that were based on research that was done in tropical field sites, which added up to about 650 or so articles. And I'll spare you the details of how we did it and how we did the allocation and whether we use partial or entire allocation to different countries. But what we found was this, that 56% of the studies were conducted in one of 7 countries. So I should say that this is based on the studies that were published in Biotropica. The trend is actually pretty similar. There's a bit of position switching for the more general and conservation biology journals. But if you look at Biotropica and Journal of Tropical Ecology, about 1,333 studies. Brazil and Costa Rica alone, 27.76% of the studies. And you have Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, Panama, Malaysia, Puerto Rico, which we did count as a separate country rather than as part of the United States, despite the political affiliation. And the other thing that's really remarkable is that 20 countries were represented by only one study. Now, this is not to say that we don't know anything about those countries, because obviously you have, in many of these countries, very strong local journals, either in English or in local language. There's also lots of work that you could consider kind of tropical research, but ends up being, say, in an agronomy journal or a fisheries journal. And we weren't reviewing local journals. We weren't reviewing any others. These were just in these two. But what we did find is that if you're flipping through the pages of Biotropica, you're basically going to learn a lot about Brazil and Costa Rica, and maybe Mexico if you get lucky and land on that page too. But what's kind of more relevant to the talk I'm talking about here is this right here, which is that 62% of the articles had a lead author that was based outside of the country in which the research was carried out. And this probably won't come as a surprise to anybody who's either worked in the tropics or maybe just sits and thinks about it for a bit. But what we had here is that 45% of the lead authors were from only 2 countries. So the United States by far had the greatest percentage of studies with a lead author from there. Brazil came in second place. I mean, Brazil is our leading source of submissions. So we could just call the journal Brazilitropica if we wanted to. But actually, and that's not necessarily a surprise either that they're going to have so many articles, because not only do they have this tremendous area, diversity of ecosystems, they have a large community. So this isn't exactly a surprise. But United States and Brazil, 34 and 11% respectively, followed by the UK, Mexico, Australia, Germany, France, Japan. You have the Netherlands over here, Canada, India, Venezuela, Colombia, and then a bunch of other countries where you also have first authors that have contributed to the literature. So again, not entirely surprising. One of my committee members once told me that ecology is the art of proving the obvious with increasingly sophisticated statistics. And this is what we probably could have told you in advance. You have a lot of Europeans or people from the United States doing research on BCI or at La Selva, right? But what really caught my attention was that we looked at all the articles that had at least 2 authors, so all the co-authored papers, collaborations, and there were about 530 of these in Biotropica and the Journal of Tropical Ecology, and 45% of them were written entirely by foreign scientists. Now, I've put American flags here because sometimes I give this talk in Brazil, and some of my examples later on will be Brazil and the United States. But what it means is that you have here, 45% of the articles were entirely German teams working in Panama, or teams from the Netherlands working in Bolivia. 28% of them were all in-country scientists. That's great. I mean, that means people are doing science locally. It's down the road from their field sites. You wouldn't necessarily expect someone from Brazil to go to the Netherlands to do their field work, although that'd be fine if they did, I guess. And only 27% of them were multinational teams. And by multinational team here, what we do mean is that you have an author from the country in which the research was being carried out, and the rest could be either from that country or any other country. And I think what we could probably agree a priori, perhaps, is that we would love it if this number were larger. This number could probably be larger. But the key is this, right? This is something that's a concern to a lot of people, and for some of the reasons which I'll walk you through in just a bit. We were really surprised that fully that many papers had absolutely 0 local collaborators on them. And part of this may be, the reason we found this surprising, or the reason we think is important, is in part because of the personal approach of the authors, right? So I work collaboratively most of my career, and our graduate program trains students to do community-based work, collaborative work, always in partnership with local institutions, local scientists. So maybe it's just that we're part of this group that thinks that the standard, the default should be that you're working collaboratively locally, and maybe this isn't as important to other people. Maybe it isn't necessarily important at all. We think it's important, but that doesn't mean that if others do otherwise, it's necessarily a bad thing. But at least from our perspective, we think that working collaboratively with local scientists is the right thing to do. It's not just that it's a good thing to do, it's that it's the right thing to do. And I would add to that you could also use communities here instead, right? So I'm approaching this because as co-authorship, those co-authors need not necessarily be academic scientists based at a university. They could be people at an NGO. They could be, I'm co-authors on a paper with a student with some indigenous leaders. I mean, it could be people who are outside of the traditional academic setting, but at least we're talking about local collaborators. But if you're also thinking about the way we approach work in general, thinking about working with local communities, with local scientists is probably the right thing to do. And there are at least a couple of reasons that I think this is the case. The first and perhaps most obvious is it really helps you better understand the social, political, and economic context in which one's research is embedded. This is not trivial, and this is certainly not trivial when you're working in tropical ecosystems. So this is my collaborator here, Anandraja. Any excuse to show the great friends that we have down in Manaus that we work with. But you know, if you work in the Amazon, understanding the political history of the Amazon and the Trans-Amazonian Highway and the culture in the 70s driven by the military dictatorship about occupying the Amazon as a means of promoting both national sovereignty and national pride. I mean, that influences us today in terms of the way we do our work. And I know that Chris probably agrees with me because he's had to wait for those permits a long time too, and he has also been concerned about getting pulled over at the airport and being accused of biopiracy even though you have all your paperwork in order and all those things. That has its roots here. In fact, it actually has its roots further back. Does anybody know who that is? And you can't answer if you do. Does anybody know who this is on the right? No guesses? So that right there is the reason that it is horrible to be a foreign researcher working in the Amazon. When they talk about foreigners coming, why are you really here? What do you really want? Are you taking some cancer-curing compound from that plant? You know, are you really studying demography? It's because of Henry Wickham, who in the late 1800s managed to take 700 seeds of Brazil nut trees and keep them pressed, managed to barge his way past customs in the port of Belém, steam across the Atlantic, and get them into the hothouses at Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, where they were able to germinate those seeds, get seedlings of rubber trees, and then export those to Malaysia and other parts of the British colonial empire, which pulled the rug out from under the Brazilian cornering of the rubber market. I mean, if you had tires or you were fighting a war, your rubber came from the city of Manaus, or at least came through the city of Manaus, which is why it was the first city in Brazil to have gas lights, which is why it has that beautiful opera house, which is why you hear the stories about people sending their laundry to be done in Paris, was because they had cornered the market on rubber trees. When Henry Wickham, the original biopirate in Manaus, got those things out into Kew, that ripped it out from under us, and then from then on, any foreigner working in the Amazon is viewed with suspicion. You're not viewed necessarily that way if you're working in the Caatinga or the Cerrado down south, but this is the political and economic context in which we work. This is why you have to get your paperwork in order when you go work in the Amazon, right? And if you don't understand, understanding this helps you understand why it is that you spend all day at the federal police station registering. It's important because it minimizes intellectual export. You hear a lot about parachute science, right? People come in, they parachute into a place, do a bunch of collecting, and then they leave. You know, the local researchers at the museum don't get specimens there. They never find out what was discovered. People never return research results. And this is something that's really important to do. And so by working collaboratively, it's a way of anchoring and making sure that you have results that stay in country where they're really needed. And I would argue that in addition to these things, it's the ethical thing to do, right? I mean, you know, we should be following ethical practices. We don't have a Hippocratic oath in our field. Maybe we should have something like that. But a lot of other professions, you know, you uphold ethical standards as a member of that profession. And I would argue that working in a foreign country and working collaboratively with people should be part of whatever ethical guidelines we think you should follow. Now, working collaboratively with scientists abroad is also personally and professionally rewarding. You can learn all kinds of really important professional skills, patience, foreign languages, right? Organizational skills, having to organize a 3-month field season in a foreign country. Those are useful skills, and you can actually package those pretty well in a job application for whatever job you choose to follow up down the road. There's all kinds of professional recognition. I found what I thought were a couple of examples here, but I wasn't sure about the U of M example, so I didn't put them up here. But at least, for instance, at the University of Florida, faculty and staff are, you know, they give every year the International Educator of the Year award. So these are people who are engaged in international collaboration. It's a big deal. You get a certificate from the provost. The president goes. It goes on your CV. You get a fancy plaque. So they only award 2 a year. It's a really big deal. There are unique opportunities for outreach and reaching out to people to talk about your science in ways that you wouldn't have otherwise. So this is actually a TV studio in Acre, Brazil, where we'd been invited to give some presentations. And you know what? It's actually really fun. It's okay to enjoy what we do. This is Michelle Mack. I don't know if anybody's ever met Michelle. She's an ecosystem ecologist, and here she is in Siberia applying some, ex-Soviet military thingy up. She's watching this thing going up the mud. She said it was a total blast to drive these things. But this kind of international work and international collaboration comes at a cost, and the cost is not trivial. It's time. It's time in going, in traveling, in doing, in organizing, in money, right? It's expensive. My tickets down to Brazil are about $1,200. It can be really, really stressful. All of these things interact to influence your productivity. You can take a real productivity hit if you work internationally, especially in some really far away places with less infrastructure than if you work nearby. And as an example of some of this, I put up here this is the page of the Brazilian government site where you go as a foreigner to find out how to get your expedição científica, which is the permitting process for you to do research in Brazil. And you'll notice a couple of things, like it's in Portuguese, right? So if you don't speak Portuguese, you don't have someone who can help you navigate this process, which is long, cumbersome, bureaucratic, and difficult. And by the way, to work in Brazil, your permits have to be submitted by your foreign collaborator, not by you. This is the stress that's involved, right? It comes at a cost. So the question that I'm interested in addressing and that I'll be talking about here in this first part is, are there other benefits that can offset these costs? So in other words, it's great that I'm having a really good time and I'm learning to be organized and that there might be an award on my CV, but are there other kinds of professional benefits that can help tilt the equation in favor of thinking about international work? And here, this is from our tenure and promotion guidelines. Please address A, the quality of the journals in which you publish, and B, the impact of your research and creative program. So I'm going to talk here in a very narrow sense. When we're talking about professional benefits, the professional benefit I was interested in was tenure, right? And then after that, the professional benefit I was interested in was promotion to full, right? And now I'm interested in the professional benefits of getting a raise in my annual evaluation, right? So it's a very narrow sense professional benefit within the context from which I'm coming. But there are certainly others in this. You can find examples, whether you're a grad student, technician, postdoc, faculty member, interested family member visiting, you can find something kind of relevant to this. So this is what you would find in our tenure and promotion guidelines. They want to know about the impact of our research or creative program. And relevant to that is a piece of advice I was given by a faculty member who, for obvious reasons, chooses to remain anonymous, which is that deans don't read, they only count. I don't know if there are any deans in the room. I'll make it up to you in just a bit. But what this really tells you is a little bit about the kinds of metrics that we're interested in as faculty. I'm not saying this is right, but what we're interested in is things that are going to give us something very tangible, which is professional advancement, and we're worried about productivity, right? We want to know, what is the impact of scholarship? Now, there are lots of different ways to define impact, right? The ways that they're defined in different ways by different people and in different contexts. So in the academic context, which is the one I'll be focusing on here, the impact might be something like citation of your work, which we're asked to comment on in our tenure and promotion guidelines. The journals in which you're publishing your work, so they were talking about the impact of those publications. And so I actually decided to pursue this question in collaboration with Stefano Alesina, who some of you may know. He's a computational ecologist at the University of Chicago. He's a brilliant guy who also has some similar research interests in scientometrics. So I actually called him up to see if he was interested in applying for a job at the University of Florida, and he politely turned me down, but then we talked about what I really wanted to talk about, which is this. So we started by reviewing 1.25 million articles that we downloaded, not the articles themselves, but all the bibliometric information about them from Scopus, from 1996 to 2012, and they go across 8 fields: analytical chemistry, genetics, condensed matter physics, ecology, geology, mathematics, psychology, evolutionary biology is on there. And we define things in a couple of ways. So we define journal placement by impact factor, and then also by the quantiles of impact factor. Top 25%, top 10%, bottom 25% in terms of impact factor of the journal. And then citation performance. Total citations of a paper published in a given year in a given journal, and that's going to be really important. Everything here is relative. It's relative to where it was published and when it was published. And then also did the same thing for quantiles. A couple of really important caveats. Citations are only one way to quantify impact. They're not the best way to quantify impact. They tell you how much of your work was cited. They don't necessarily tell you how good it is. They don't tell you necessarily how important it is. And there are lots of other ways to quantify impact. I know a faculty member who's got a very poorly cited paper that's responsible for the conservation of something like 5,000 hectares in Central Florida. I would argue that's a much higher impact paper than maybe something narrow theoretical that has 500 citations. We're defining impact this way. There are lots of different ways. And the other thing is we used impact factor not because we think it's useful. I think it's useless. I mean, it's used improperly so often it's not useful. But it's used by others in evaluation, not just in this context, but in other countries as well. Do I think that should change? Yes, but it's currently what's being done, and so we thought it was a useful metric to show. And so here's an example of what we did for every one of those 1.25 million articles. So Stefano, Matt Smith was part of this work as well, one of his students. We would take the article, we would identify the country in which the institution of each author was based. Common problem in scientometrics, someone can be from a country but working in another one. We can talk about it later if you want, but it's a relatively small proportion of authors, it appears. We would look at the impact factor of the journal in 2011. That's the one we use as kind of our average for all of them. And then the number of citations that that article had up until the point at which we downloaded the data sets. And this is a really important difference from previous work that had tried to look at national identity is the way in which we group the authorship of countries, which I'll show you in just a moment. If I forget, you have to remind me. So the first thing we did is, in terms of analysis, it's pretty straightforward. 2 approaches and 4 different models. I'll go over them quickly, but it doesn't really matter. I'm more putting them up here so that I have some cues to tell you the things that we included in the model that previous work has shown to be important in terms of influencing both citation rates and where articles end up. So we were interested in finding out basically if the impact factor of the journal or the number of citations that your article had was influenced by the number of authors, the number of countries in the author list, in other words, that collaboration, international collaboration thing that we were interested in studying, the number of references, because it's been shown that the number of references your article has directly relates to the number of citations that that article will get, and because a lot of high impact factor journals have citation limits, there's all kinds of relationships here. And then specific country affiliation. I'll talk about this in the next slide. And here we have number of authors, number of countries in the author list, the number of references, the journal, because what journal your article is in influences how many citations it gets. We already know that. Articles in Science or Nature or PNAS tend to be cited more simply because they're in Science or Nature or PNAS, right? The age obviously is going to influence how many citations something gets. Citations accumulate over time. And again, specific country affiliations. And the results were pretty similar, which is why I'm just quickly going over the things that are in the model. When we talk about country affiliations, this is something we did differently, right? We actually considered each combinations of co-authorship as an independent unit. So for instance, the metric that we'll use as this baseline is the United States. And the figures I'm going to show you in just a second, you're going to see some things that look like a teeter-totter almost, and the United States is the point in the middle, okay? That's just the baseline against which the others are compared. You could have done it with any country, but we're in the United States, we chose the United States. And so we would say, compare then the coefficient of the slope for all articles that had authors just from Brazil. In a separate category, we would have all articles that had authors from Brazil and the United States, but no other countries. Another category is articles that had authors from Brazil, the United States, and Mexico. That's different from articles with only Mexican authors, only Canadians, and articles that had US, Brazil, Mexico, Canada. This is what's different from in the past. In the past, people have looked at the combinations, but not treated each one as kind of a separate experimental treatment, if you will. But it allows us to do something that's really interesting, which is why we did it this way, right? Let's go straight to the results. Big picture, result number 1 overall. The international collaboration has a really strong and really positive effect on article performance. The more countries you have represented on the author list, the articles will have more citations relative to others that are in the same journal in the same year. So again, relativizing, right? We're not comparing science papers with papers in Copia here. Articles published in journal, the more authors you have, the higher the likelihood that you're going to be published in a journal that has a higher impact factor or is in a higher quartile of impact factor. And this is significant even after controlling for things that have previously been shown to be important. Co-author number. We already knew that the more authors you have in an article, the more citations it's going to get. So this is above and beyond the effect of co-author number. And the question is then, why? Right? Why is it that international collaboration has such a strong effect on performance above and beyond simply having a lot of authors or being in a high-profile journal? And there are a couple of reasons that we came up with. Right? So the first is that multinational authorship could reflect research that's global in scope or perhaps more generally applicable. Globally widespread authors could result in greater visibility, right? They have independent social networks. They're presenting at conferences in their home countries as well as in international conferences in different places. More people are going to find out about the work. More groups of students are going to be citing the work and talking about it. They're presenting at different conferences, this kind of thing. So it could be that because you have more countries represented, it's not that you simply have more social networks. You know, if you have 5 authors from the United States, those 5 authors have their own social networks. But if you have 5 authors from 5 different countries, they're non-overlapping social networks, right? And more countries perhaps opens you to more opportunities for funding research. Both sets of co-authors are applying for funding in their home country to their funding agencies. And of course, there's a feedback loop here, right? If you get more funding, you can pursue more work and do more studies, include more collaborators, that kind of thing. Or maybe the work is simply better, right? That's another alternative. We've come up with these arguments about how it's a happenstance of collaboration, but it could also be that when you have international collaborators in the same place at the same time, their work is better. And this brings us to this really important concept, which you may have seen re-upped recently in light of kind of conversations that are happening on the national political level, which is the importance of diversity and how it influences the quality of work in professional work environments and things like that. This concept of informational diversity. And when I was looking for stock photos to use in a talk where I could present the concept of informational diversity, I came across this photo on freedigitalphotos.net stock photo site. It's called Multi-Ethnic Team Endorsed by some photographer named Ambro, which is supposed to show this concept of like, look, a really diverse team working together. I wanted to tell Ambro, like, nice try, you didn't really hit the note here, right? You've got a multi-ethnic team, but it's still being led by this one, and everyone else is out of focus. This is not what we want to represent as a team, although I will say, remember this image because it may be useful in a later part of the talk. But I just think this is great. I was just going to say, like, you're almost there, but not quite. The concept of informational diversity is that it promotes hard work and creativity before any interactions actually take place, right? Has anybody ever had to go and give a presentation in a place where they don't speak the language? You work on it. You strip away all the excess words. You do what I always forget to do, which is you work on speaking more slowly, right? You prepare your materials. You make sure the slides are okay. I have prepared talks for the ESA the morning I'm giving the talk, right? Because I'm more comfortable in that environment. I know the environment. I know the people. It's more forgiving. I can work my way around language issues. I can dance my way around questions. The idea of informational diversity is that by virtue of the fact that you're anticipating that it's a challenging cultural environment to work with because it's people who are different from you. It's not just this idea that different people bring different ideas to the table and from that good stuff emerges. That's true too. It's that preparation goes into working with a complex team because you have to be prepared. It's complicated. You're coming from different places, from different backgrounds, different languages, different skill sets or disciplines. You cannot waste time. You have to be well prepared in order for the work time to be effective. It's a really interesting idea, this idea that diversity enhances the quality of work, but not always for the reasons we think, which is just more ideas on the table. It's because you worked harder beforehand, before actually walking into the room. Of course, but there is a second really interesting result, and this is the one that is key in terms of the categorization, and that is that national identity matters and it can be positive or negative. And here I'm talking about the combination of countries that are involved in the authorship of the paper, right? So here's the United States in the middle. This is for journal placement, articles by US authors. Anything here is higher than you would expect statistically. Anything here, they're ending up in lower than expected journals in terms of impact factor. And so what you can see here, for instance, is that Brazilian authors are way down here. The articles are ending up in journals with lower than expected impact factors, right? But if you look at papers by US and Brazilian authors in collaboration, they pop up all the way up here, okay? So they're actually ended up, it's slightly higher impact factor journals than you would have expected otherwise. And here you have other combinations as well. And you can see back here, these are some in lower quality, lower than expected, and these are the ones that are higher than expected. How about this for citation performance? Now, the US, again, is the fulcrum here, the middle. If you look, actually, articles by Brazilians are actually getting cited more than other articles in the same journals in the same year. They're exceeding the performance in terms of citation that you would expect. And if you actually have collaborative work between US and Brazilian scientists, it's all the way up here. They're cited they have amongst the highest citation rates, even after you correct for the other factors. So this is strictly a relative comparison, right? They're getting cited more than the articles that are on either side of them in the literature that are by either Brazilians only, US only, UK, German, Canadian, US, Austrians, Norway, Finland, Czech Republic, the UK. Their citation rates are way, way up. Which begs the question, right? And there are lots of other examples. Again, I chose this one because that's where I work. What's behind these patterns? Why is it that papers by Brazilian authors are underperforming at the journal level, but perhaps overperforming at the citation level? And this is, I think, because there are a couple of hypotheses. Journal placement. There's a negative bias at the peer review stage. Author, an editor or reviewer see a paper and they go, I've never heard of the Universidade Federal de Tocantins. What is some, is this some high school in Brazil? No, I think this is not appropriate. This should go to a regional journal. We're not even going to send it. It's going to be a desk reject. But there's also the biased author effect, which is something that's very common that you hear from a lot of my colleagues in Latin America, which is, I'm not even going to bother sending my work to Ecology because they never accept our work anyway. That's why I'm sending it to Biotropica or Copia instead. In other words, they're not even in the arena, right? It's the authors that are biased, and they're undercutting their opportunity. They're not even sending to the journal to have it rejected or accepted in the first place. Now, in terms of citation performance, what could be behind the pattern? Again, it could just be that they're doing better science. That's why those collaborative papers were cited more. But it could also be that there's a citation bias. And this has a lot to do with the individual countries. Brazil has a really large and really insular community of scientists. And they also are, of course, the place where you have a lot of really great research on habitat fragmentation in the Atlantic forest, floristic diversity, and everybody cites this paper, right? This was published only in 2000, but it's already Biotropica's #2 in terms of overall citations and citations per year because it gets cited by everybody. So there are reasons for citation bias that could be driven by where the work is done and who it's attributed to or what discipline it's in or if it's a methodological technique, right? But the key here is the word bias is in 3 of these 4 explanations, right? And so why is it that we have this bias? And this is really where I've moved a lot of this direction now, which is the bias, and in particular, let's start with the first one, right? Which is this bias at the review stage. Who is it that's the front line that's reviewing articles? And that's your editorial boards. In fact, this is an issue that goes way back in the sociology of science. Diana Crane, back in 1967, first started to write about gatekeepers, the gatekeepers of science in the American Sociologist, and the fact that this is something that I don't think a lot of people appreciate, even editors don't necessarily appreciate. We think of ourselves as kind of like, my job is to evaluate and critique. We're not. This is a very different way of visualizing and conceptualizing what someone does when they're the editor. They're a gatekeeper, right? And they're not necessarily like these kinds of gatekeepers. I guess you're on the AmNat Ed board, aren't you? I guess, do you want to be seriously answered? So editors are really powerful. And this is not something that in ecology we talk about very much, power, right? It's the sociologists, right? People who do sociology of science who talk about power. Of course, they're sociologists. Power imbalances, power dynamics, right? Editors are powerful. They are a powerful small group. They are an elite. We don't like to, it's okay, you can do that. You're a member of a small, elite, powerful group if you're an editor, right? As an editor, when you make a decision to recommend or accept a paper, you confer legitimacy not only on the research, but on the researchers themselves. You are saying that these researchers have the stamp of approval from the scientific community to be part of this club we call scientists, right? They shape the direction of the field, what topics are hot or not, what approaches are hot or not. They help choose new editors, right? Often from, of course, their own networks of collaborators, former students, colleagues down the hall, people who are similar to them, because we know people tend to associate with people who are similar. And this confers status and visibility on a new select group of individuals who themselves are going to benefit from the professional benefits that go with being on an editorial board. That's also something that's in our tenure and promotion guidelines. Are you on an editorial board? That's recognition of status in the scientific community. And so this small group of gatekeepers means that there is the potential here to have a lot of insularity, right? And this comes from this recognition of editor power, but also what we know about workplace environments and workforce diversity, which is that if you have a small group of people that has a certain set of demographic characteristics, they're likely to choose as their replacements people who have similar demographic characteristics, which leads to this feedback loop. And of course, if you're a collaborator, you're someone who's choosing a collaborator, they probably see science the same way you do. They think the same things are really useful. So they're bringing people on board who are similar to them in more ways than one. And they can reinforce this loop of having editorial boards that have tunnel vision or demographically really similar as a result of that. And so we're working on this now. It's called the Gatekeeper Project. It's an attempt to quantify editorial board composition before we can go to the next step, which is, do these changes in editorial board composition have an effect? So I'm going to quickly go through a couple quick results. Previously published this. The first one that came out of the Gatekeeper Project, again with Alyssa Cho and a group of students in one of my classes, was looking at the gender breakdown on editorial boards. This is the 50% line. This is the proportion of women on editorial boards. You can see that this is kind of a weird one, but they maybe approach 40% in a few. You get closer in others, but the results are, pretty depressing across the board. We're nowhere near parity. We could talk later about what so this is something that we go through with reviewers all the time. What is the null model here? Is the null model the proportion, say, of women who are in the field, and that's what the editorial board should look like? I'll tell you right now, my answer to that is always no. Editorial boards are not under any kind of legal constraint to represent any kind of, they should be aspirational, is the way I usually put it, right? They're not supposed to be reflective necessarily. They can be in other ways, but there's no reason why they necessarily should. I think editorial boards, just like any other group of gatekeepers, including faculty, should look like what you want the profession to look like, not necessarily what it looks like right now. The next step we've looked at here is geographic diversity of editorial boards. And in this case, we extended it. This is a 30-year review. This is a little bit different. I mean, these questions about editorial boards started way back, but most of the studies, to be perfectly frank, they were wide. They might have looked at 50 or 60 journals, but they would look at the editorial board composition over the course of 1 year, right? So they weren't very deep. And one of the things we know is that there's become an increasing awareness of issues about things like gender and STEM, or ethnic diversity and STEM. And so we were really interested in taking a longitudinal approach and seeing if there have been changes over time. And that's kind of the big divergence between the approach we've taken and what's been done in the world of kind of looking at gatekeepers in the past. There is one other thing too, which is the analyses have usually been pretty. And so we wanted to, build on them a little bit.
So you don't want me to see that?
No, please don't. So there are two reasons to think about the geographic distribution. First, we've had the emergence of new STEM hotspots across the globe, right? And so you're seeing more countries and places represented in the pages of journals. And also, we also, at least in our field, to try to make it relevant to us, you also have the concentration of a lot of really important and interesting stuff, like biodiversity in the global south, right? Which is not something that you typically see reflected on editorial board pages. At least that's what the thought was in the past. So the idea is that we were interested in testing hypotheses about whether, with increasing recognition, that if you're actually based in a place like my collaborator at Aldo is, you actually are in a better position to, say, judge the science that's being done there, or understand the constraints, economic, political, social, scientific, of the work that's being done there, in ways that someone who is outside of that ecosystem can be a really smart person, but because they don't know the system well, or they haven't worked there, or they're not familiar with the constraints that are available, maybe they're not in the best position to judge what you could or couldn't do, or what you can and can't do in the future. So very quickly, because I'm running out of time here, we had 3,827 editors from 24 journals. That's unique editors. Sometimes people serve, obviously, over the course of this 3 decades on the editorial boards of different journals. And you do, in fact, see that the geographic richness, we approach this as ecologists, right? So this is just species richness. This is geographic richness does, in fact, increase over time. whether it's the cumulative richness, the number of countries total. We've now had up to 70 countries represented on editorial boards, but also the number of countries represented in any given year. And this is no surprise. It's just a species-area relationship. Editorial boards have gotten a lot bigger over time. We looked at the same journals. The journals we selected were journals that we had to have for the entire 30-year period. And this is what happens to the number of editors of those journals over time. So the same 24 journals, you've just got a lot more people serving on the boards. But if you actually calculate the diversity, the same way we do, for instance, species diversity, you can see that the diversity of these editorial boards has remained essentially flat and extremely low over the entire time period. And these editors are based, in fact, this is truly remarkable, 55% of them are based in the United States, 12% of them, in fact, I wasn't sure whether I should move it but you can't see the UK, 12% of them are based in the UK. The rest of them are based in primarily a couple of European countries, but this is where most of the editors are, right here. Not necessarily a surprise, right? Big country, but by scientific region, I'll work on that. Editors by global region, North America, Europe, and Central Asia. These are the World Bank geographic region categorizations. But what you can see here is basically there's almost no editors from sub-Saharan Africa. This line right here is East Asia and the Pacific, and that one right there is Latin America. And if you, instead of organizing by global region, you organize by what national income category they're in, high income, low income, these World Bank categories, it's similarly depressing, right? We basically have no editors from any, very few. There's a handful of editors, mainly Brazilians, a couple of Mexicans from low-income countries. There are more editors from Norway or Sweden or the Netherlands than there are from Brazil, Mexico, or India, right? Cumulatively on any of these editorial boards, including editorial boards focused on high-diversity ecosystems like Brazil, India. The next step we're looking at then is drilling down to look at the institutional diversity of editorial boards. Something that one of my editors, Terry Glynn, has asked me to do a lot is to remember that there is a lot of really good science going on at institutions that are not R1 research institutions, right? And so to think about that when we're selecting editors, which is now something that we include, but we decided to do this as the next step with another group of students. So this is very preliminary. It's 788 US-based editors. And what you can find is that well over 75, something like 80% of them are at a school like the U of M. You have a surprising, the next category here would be government agencies, USDA, Forest Service, that kind of stuff. This is museums, or museums, botanical gardens, and NGOs all pooled together. This is small liberal arts colleges and baccalaureate institutions. These are Carnegie classifications. The Smithsonian is kind of a weird place, so I put it in a separate category because it includes both the National Museum of Natural History, which would go over here, but also STRI in Panama, which I don't know where it should go. These are primarily master's institutions. This is industry. We have one reviewer from industry for forestry. There are some more because agronomy has a fair number of industry. Notable were the complete lack of anybody from community colleges or tribal colleges and universities, right? Even though you've got really good people working there, and I want to emphasize that as an editor, I can tell you that someone can be a great researcher. That doesn't make them a great editor, and someone can not do very much research, but they will still be a really good editor. Those are sometimes overlapping, but not always skill sets. So there's no reason why I happen to look up, a local tribal college here. There's a faculty member there with a PhD in forest science who looks like they would make a great editor, right? Based on their training, and they could certainly be an editor for a lot of the kinds of issues that a lot of journals now are including as well. So, I don't see any reason for this to persist. So to wrap up here, take-home messages: international collaboration and funding, support for research in international, in collaboration, gives a really high return on investment, especially for the kinds of things that we're interested in promoting here at the university or that will get you promoted at the university. Implicit biases may influence how research is judged during the evaluation and citation phases. And this is going to depend a lot, perhaps, on the countries that are involved. I'm not saying you should not. You will notice I went very through and I didn't point out some of the other ones. I am not telling you should not work with countries on the red bar sides, right? I am saying that there's something going on there and we need to figure out what it is. That's some great science being done. But there are clearly disparities that we need to be aware of. The biases in the production, diffusion, and evaluation of scholarship can be overcome. If you want more international representation on your editorial boards, look to your authors. This is the cumulative number of countries represented in those 24 journals over the course of the 30 years among the editors. This is in the authors of the papers in those journals, right? You've got 175 countries represented on those author lists, so not everybody's going to necessarily have the skill set. But this notion that you hear this a lot from other editors, it's so hard to get, we invite people, they turn us down, it's hard to find editors who are in something. Yes, it is. It takes away from my writing papers. And I do get turned down a lot more, but you've got to work on it. And the reason is that biases in the production and diffusion of knowledge have real socioeconomic consequences. Kofi Annan wrote a really great essay in Science, which points out that 95% of the new science in the world is created by countries comprising only 1/5 of the world's population. And much of that science, especially in areas like health, it neglects problems that afflict most of the world's people. This unbalanced distribution of science and scientific activity generates serious problems not only for the scientific community in developing countries, but for development itself. It accelerates the disparity between advanced and developing countries, creating social and economic difficulties at both the national and international levels. What Kofi Annan is saying is really important. This is what turned me into someone who started working on scientometric problems. Scientific productivity, it doesn't matter the discipline. You could be publishing on lizard abundance or early Hungarian cabinet making or whatever you want, but scientific productivity leads to socioeconomic development. It's a driver of development for countries that need it. It is the difference, right? Knowledge is power, okay? I used to have a picture of both Machiavelli and Kofi Annan because they both felt the same thing, right? They knew it. Knowledge is power. So information, scientific creation, scientific creativity, and knowledge is what flips you from being an extraction-based economy, like a lot of the ones where some of us work, to being an information and knowledge-based economy like the United States, right? Scientific productivity takes you from this to this, irrespective of the discipline. And it just so happens that there's an added benefit, is that if you're doing science here, you're probably doing it on problems that benefit local people. And so the rest of my research program, and we don't have time to do it now, unfortunately, is trying to elaborate a little bit about the pattern that's basically represented in this slide, which is, can anybody want to shout out what they see here? It's not actually a map. Yeah, it looks like it. It's not. But the wonderful thing is this was done by a person who's actually working with a lot of the data from Elsevier, I think. But what this is it's not a map. It's actually just point connections between all the co-authors of papers in a bunch of Elsevier journals. And so what you can see is the representation of what looks like a map, because we have this unbalanced distribution of knowledge distribution up here, a little bit, Sao Paulo, India, Japan, it looks like, a little bit in Australia. And we've got lots of connections here and lots of productivity here, but very little here. And what I'm interested in pursuing next, and those of you who can stick around, I may be able to answer it in the questions, is why we have so few of the connections here, right? So this is what we're working towards, trying to understand why you don't have these and what we can do in terms of science policy to promote South-South collaboration and greater scientific productivity, so that the map, you start to see these outlines of these places down here. I have a little bit more on the future, but instead, time's up, so I'll just answer any questions you might have. And thanks a lot for your attention. And you've got someone to go and run and pick up in just a bit. So you're actually the reason I'm cutting it short. So, no. It's also because I'm looking at 5:01 and freaking out. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, everybody. Maybe I'll show one more thing. This is the cool thing. So this is all the papers from a study we've got here. We're looking at something like, actually this is based on like 7,000 articles. This is the social network of co-authors in Brazil. So any paper that has a Brazilian co-author, this is the social network, collaborative network of those authors. But if you actually look at the most productive, this is what it looks like. So for instance, people in Brazil work in isolation with the exception of this. Who's in this node, why? This is kind of the direction we're going. We're trying to figure out that part right there. Take questions, or you guys could just bail. It's 5 o'clock. It's up to you. Yeah, please. this is not, I was not going to go through all these slides, but I thought someone might ask me that question. We're actually trying to figure that out. So we're actually, we tend to think in geographic terms, right? You know, Latin America, Africa, but and it's true, we have seen an upsurge in research from some, you know, Latin America, but not Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of South Africa. And so what we're trying to do is actually pull it apart and understand. It's the primary predictors of scientific productivity in any particular region are going to be you know, how big the country is, the population size of the country, its GDP. There's sometimes a hint of Human Development Index, which again reflects the ability to invest GDP in education. And in general, most of them have gone up over time, but that's going to be the primary predictor. So again, it's a development issue. There's a chicken and egg problem, but Kofi Annan, who knows something about that kind of stuff, made it very clear. If you're investing in knowledge that has a positive return on development, which means you're going to invest more in science as a country. How to jumpstart that is the issue. Then the differences among countries are going to be based on how big is the country, because that's going to influence how many scientists you have, how many universities do you have. There are cultural and colonial legacies, right? So you might have a lot of, you know, there's this weird connection between Bolivia and the Netherlands in forestry, which has led to Bolivia being, you know, increasing from 0 papers in the 1980s and 90s to a 2,200% increase over 0 plus 0.5 or whatever I did. And you know, there's a reason that, you know, some people work in some countries. So colonial history influences productivity as well, and that's the hard part. We don't really know. Yeah.
What does the editorial board for Biotropica look like, and how is the research that you've done influenced how you think about the ranking out of what you choose?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question because it allows me to brag. How Biotropica's editorial board looks and how this work has influenced that. So that's Biotropica. We're the best on this list. We're also the only, we're one of only 2 journals that's had a woman as editor-in-chief. American Journal of Botany. 3, American, I don't think American Naturalist is on this list, is it? No, MNat wasn't in this study, so we didn't get Judy Bronstein. But we're doing pretty good. But we have to work really hard. I haven't pulled the data, and I didn't want to talk about it. But for instance, I'm renewing. You know, the beginning of the year means going over the editorial board, and so I'm now keeping track not only of who we invite. It's a struggle because how it shaped my perspective as an editor means I have a lot of axes along which I have to worry for a journal like Biotropica. I worry about this axis. I worry about geography as well. And like all editors, I mean, I also worry about where we want submissions or emerging trends or things like that. So I have to balance who I can get, but I also need another HERP person, and we would really love more submissions from China, right? So it's sometimes very difficult to balance. We're still at around 42%. And geographically, we're also the best, and have been for a while, but we certainly didn't start out that way. Previous editor emeritus Jaburgazul really started working that direction. So it's really hard. I will say where we fail, and we have failed since since before I was editor-in-chief as an associate editor, we work really hard with sub-Saharan Africa. It's so hard, and it's partly because it would be easy for us to go to South Africa perhaps and get people, but if we're in DRC, Congo, it's really tough. And we've had a few, but you've got great scientists or NGO. We have a fair amount of people from NGOs. We have some on our editorial board as well. And they're in really high demand because they're recognized as someone who's active in the field. They're really good scholarship. Their home institutions end up putting them in an administrative role. They have tons of students. So it's really hard. We also have to balance that with the idea that we're imposing on someone saying, hey, do you want to be on our editorial board? And they're like, I've got a million things going on, but it's important. I know it's important. I'm going to say yes, even though I should probably say no. We don't want to put people in a position where they're saying yes, even though they shouldn't do it. It's really tough. That has been our biggest failure, is finding editors. We do have a lot of people that have the right perspective, from my point of view, who work in sub-Saharan Africa, and so invite lots of reviewers from the region. And so that's another way, right? Once we start getting people into our reviewer database, we can pull them into our editorial database down the road. You mean the figure at the very end?
Yeah.
Um,
Am I reading that correctly?
I mean, you're seeing this over here. You know, since I didn't make the map, and I don't know that, you know, this went around, you know, this was flying around. I didn't, but without a lot of details about what journals were chosen and things like that, I'd be surprised. I think it's partly two things. I think that that's one of the STEM hotspots, which we identified in our paper as well. You know, there's this massive, emergence of South Korea, Singapore, various locations in China, Malaysia in some disciplines as being scientific productivity hotspots. They're all national, so they don't need collaborations because they're investing tons of money, and they're also bringing back expats to work in-house. So there's, you know, if anybody actually still gets the paper, a copy of Science, usually the last 4 pages or 5 pages of Science are Chinese universities that are advertising the amazing salaries and conditions at universities in, you know, cities that 20 years ago basically didn't exist, that now are, you know, massive metropolis. That, you know, they're bringing talent in. They don't need collaborations. It's all being done in-house locally with either local talent or talent that's you know, moved there. So I think that's part of the reason why. I would say this though. I think there is also that's a challenge, I think, for collaboration for a lot of people, based anecdotally on colleagues I have who are at Chinese institutions, either Chinese colleagues or colleagues who are who were recruited to work in China, is that it's a challenging structure to overcome in some places unless you know, it takes some time to learn how to work within that system, and I think that's part of the reason why you see less collaboration. And it could also be bias, you know. You know, language issues and hard, and you know, there a lot of it is perception. Language of instruction is English.
There's a lot of collaboration with European kind of folks when I'm reading that.
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's easy.
No.
I mean,
China, Europe.
oh, here?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think that's probably the case. And we have a little bit here, but not too much. Yeah. But I mean, this also reflects the fact that in the United States, you may not need to collaborate internationally a lot because, you know, I mean, if you're doing bench work, you know, your ideal collaborator, you know, this is where we are, right? Somewhere over here. I mean, your collaborator could be here, here, here. Maybe, you know, maybe there's no need to go outside. Where I'm surprised to see less collaboration is in a field like ours, where if the field sites are here, right? You know, you would, and you do see this, like the CTFS network. You've got these collaborations on the 50-hectare plot analyses that are, you know, Chinese scientists working with the groups in Stry and Massachusetts and all these other places. Where you also see a lot of that is, again, you're seeing a lot of sub-global collaboration, regional collaboration. There's a lot of collaboration between Malaysia, China, Indonesia, right? Essentially, which is what you'd kind of want. They don't need us. They've got more money than we do. Their granting agencies are supporting more. They've got better infrastructure for science. Their reward, you know, for science is better. You're given the resources you need. Your field sites are right there. Why? I mean, not to be mean or anything, but why would, if I was at Tsinghua Bana or something, why would I collaborate with someone at Florida or Michigan? Because, like, they've got more grant money than we do. They've got more students. They've got more resources. They don't need us. They might need a HIMSA, if you know HIMSA, but they don't need us. Questions from anybody else? Happy to do it or chat afterwards. I know people are incredibly polite. You don't have to stick around if you got to go. Thank you all.